Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the May 2023 Council Agenda Briefing. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and their elders past and present. I would like to advise everyone that the audio of this meeting is being live streamed to YouTube. I request everyone to turn off your mobile phones. I remind you that audio recording of the meeting proceedings and photography within the chamber is prohibited unless prior approval has been granted, and councillors and city officers are reminded to disclose any declarations of financial interests and interests affecting impartiality, and are requested to activate their microphones when addressing the meeting. So, with that, welcome. Item 1 is the declaration of opening, and I declare this meeting open at 1 minute past 6 p.m. I do have an announcement to make. Earlier this month, I received the sad news that Mr. Robert Maxwell Simper passed away on the 30th of April. Mr. Simper was a keen observer of the governance of the city and was a regular guest at council meetings. Like many of us, I had a great many conversations with Mr. Simper over the years, and he always had something interesting to share. On behalf of the City Administration and Council, I would like to offer our sincere condolences to Mr. Simper's friends and loved ones. He will be missed. Items for Council tonight, agenda items 2, 3, 6, 7, 8.1, 8.2, 9, 11, 13 and 14 will be dealt with at the ordinary council meeting to be held 23 May 2023. We move to item 4, which is attendance. Item 4.1 is apologies. There are no apologies this evening, but I have received contact from Councillor Glenn Cridland. He is on his way, but he's fighting through traffic, so he may be a bit late to tonight's meeting. Item 4.2 is approved leaves of absence, of which there are nil this evening. Item 5 is declarations of interest. Councillors, does anyone have any interest that they wish to declare this evening? No interest to declare, okay. Moving on to item 8, which is presentations, and item 8.3 is deputations. This evening we have 4 speakers who will have up to 10 minutes to address council. And with that, I'd like to welcome Joanne Ord of Como, who is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.1.1. Welcome, Ms. Ord.
Hi, everybody. Are we on? Yes?
Certainly are.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. So I'd like to start by saying that I do know the RAF project is a legacy project for a number of people here, and I'm not a golfer. Since the RAF concept appeared, it did sound interesting to me. And so I thought I'd just pay attention to the numbers, as my background is in engineering and feasibility. And so I read the information as it became available, and I was aware of the city's online survey and workshop results, but I won't go into respondent percentages, as I believe a previous deputation covered that. But I did note the report stated the sampling approach adopted was one of convenience rather than a stratified random approach. And I am of the view that it was a bit of a stretch to publicly state that there was broad community support for the RAF. It was certainly not absolute, and extrapolation and general statements are often used in public messaging, and messaging the public has no control over. Many take such statements as gospel. Since attending a couple of council meetings recently, I've learned that it could also be publicly stated that there is a significant portion of the community that has had concerns over RAF costing and viability. On the original RAF concept, residents had no choice but to trust the city's public statements, redacted documents, and a brief desktop Deloitte review. Whilst the Deloitte report was colourful with an eye-catching layout, as these reports often are, the content was underwhelming. The number of limitations outlined was substantial, and the only part of any real substance was the statement that the contingencies, sinking fund allowances, and aspects of indexation were towards the lower end of expectations. And these are red flags that were very gently put. We know commercial in confidence is often applied to protect potential contract discussions, but it can also be applied when it may already be apparent that a project's feasibility is borderline, yet it is deemed important to maintain momentum or appearance. I've seen that happen too. The issue of the appointment of a project manager to retain federal funds and appear committed to the project created a council and public debate that confused me. Over 50% of the estimated capital funding source was not confirmed. It was merely assumed, amongst other unknowns. There is a difference between stating a funding amount is committed rather than stating the funds of that commitment are secured. I was also aware of just over 2,000 verified signatures received via petition, urging council and the city to effectively hurry up. And this petition confirmed the opinion of only 7% of the city's eligible voters, of which there are over 30,000. For the record, I didn't sign that petition because whilst it conveyed a section of the community's frustrations, it did not represent my own views, and as I've subsequently found out, the views of many other community members. I couldn't understand the vitriol aimed at certain members. I'm not on social media, but nevertheless I heard about it. I felt those who continued to question the data were doing residents a valuable service by scrutinising information that we weren't privy to. I didn't want a RAF at any cost. I might have liked a viable one, however. We see it frequently in construction, both small and large scale. Those who don't carry out comprehensive due diligence and really challenge the numbers often fail. Just because a report or estimate is produced by a consultant does not mean it's robust and without flaws, minor or even fatal. I've seen many people hang their hats on consultant reports. The effects of material escalation alone were starting to occur pre-COVID. Labour shortages and interest rate increases followed. I was disappointed that Council endorsed the city to pursue the staged RAF process last year in November 2022. But perhaps it was necessary to prove to all that even a scaled-down version is not viable. It is important to note that within the space of less than 6 months, the city had changed its position on when it deemed state funding integral. In November, state funding was not deemed integral for Stage 1, yet by March, only 5 months later, it was. In fact, it was essentially a showstopper, and the operational model had not improved. I mean no disrespect, but I hope the city can appreciate that this rapid change in stance didn't promote confidence in the city's ability to effectively forecast and manage construction and operating costs for the RAF Stage 1 or otherwise. In a way, it also served to validate concerns over the original costings of the RAF that we weren't able to assess ourselves. It's not uncommon for estimators and building surveyors to allow up to 40% or even 50% upper limit of accuracy dependent on complexity, on top of an indicative BCE at such an early stage of project definition, where unknowns and assumptions are rife and often outweigh the knowns. The messaging didn't help the cause when relaying these estimate figures. Many residents take these as gospel, as I mentioned earlier, and it is simply not the case when estimating any stage of a project. I'm sure many people will have heard of this saying, it doesn't matter how much lipstick you put on the pig, it's still a pig. And again, I mean no disrespect, it just refers to a project that didn't get off the ground despite much background effort. Or if it did, it might have been beset by cost blowouts, for example. So from pre-concept to FID, every stage is a gate and must be subjected to rigorous scrutiny without emotion or political agenda. If the numbers don't stack up, the gate cannot open. The RAF Stage 1 numbers don't stack up and that gate must remain closed. At the March Council meeting, an alternative motion was proposed and supported by Council. We had to trust that that motion wasn't politically motivated. It was also asserted at that meeting that pursuing the alternative motion costs us nothing. Review of the monthly reports confirms expenditure has in fact continued. and now approaches $1.64 million. So I'm unsure how that assertion was correct. With the latest correspondence from the Minister stating nothing different from previous correspondence, in that the $20 million is not forthcoming, I hope no further alternative motions will be put forward and no further expenditure will be incurred pursuing the RAF. I understand the city wishes to retain the federal funds, and it does make sense to try to do so. There is no harm in the city and its councillors agreeing the RAF is not viable. Perceived reputational damage can be repaired. The city's reputation would actually improve in the eyes of many residents. Industry partners and other levels of government are well aware of economic pressures, making many projects fall over well before execution. And in turn, residents are well aware of increasing pressure on household budgets. There may be short-term disappointment voiced by a portion of the city, but the reality of the numbers is clear. I'm sure residents would avoid putting their own households into that kind of financial situation, and the city's house can be no different. Being seen to keep an electoral promise or adheres to a strategic plan cannot take precedence over being financially responsible to the city's residents. We are your stakeholders. I appreciate the passion on both sides. It would be untrue to say that concerted effort has not been made by all involved. Remember, I thought the idea of the RAF could be interesting, but the responsible thing to do is to accept the city's recommendation not to proceed with the RAF, rather than to keep applying that lipstick, hoping for a different outcome. I thank you for your time.
Thank you for your deputation, Ms Ord. Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms Ord while she's still at the table?
Sorry.
I may have called you back for no reason, but any questions, councillors? No. Thank you for your deputation. I'd now like to invite Ms Cecilia Brooke of South Perth, who is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.1.1. Welcome, Ms Brooke.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Mr Mayor, before I make my deputation, may I also join with you and the city in the sad passing of Bob on behalf of COSPRA and all ratepayers of the City of South Perth. Thank you. Thanks to some realistic and diligent analysis carried out by council officers, the RAF pipe dream that turned into a financial nightmare looks like it is finally over. However, the folly that was a belief that the RAF could be built for $80 million and be self-sustaining has left behind some significant scars in its wake. The nearly $2 million of taxpayers' money that has been spent only to result in no tangible benefit is a travesty. Not to mention the enormous number of council staff hours that must have been spent on pursuing the pipe dream, when this valuable time that is paid for by the ratepayers could have been more productively spent on achieving real benefits. Claims to be made by so-called eminent people that the demise of the RAF was due to a lack of will and poor decision-making. In the entire time the RAF has been pursued, COSPRA has not seen any lack of will on part of any councillor. In fact, it seems some were hell-bent on pushing ahead, notwithstanding the lack of sufficient funding to enable a final investment decision to be made. There seemed to be a blind acceptance of a business case that has to be proven to be ill-conceived and faulty in its assumptions. The ire that has sometimes been directed at some financially responsible councillors perhaps should have been directed at the perpetrators of the shaky RAF plan and those who blindly followed it down the burrow. The bullying and intimidation that has taken place over the last few years is reprehensible. It is a sad day indeed when elected councillors who are acting in good faith to fairly represent all constituents are subjected to this type of behaviour. This is unbecoming of how a council should operate. Those who have been elected on a platform of sound financial management and transparent and accountable government should perhaps reflect on the events of the past few years and mend their ways to facilitate the development of strong and effective leadership. Finally, a word on the strategic community plan. Strategic plans should be living documents that evolve and are amended over time. They need to consider economic reality and be amended appropriately to suit current circumstances. Such a plan is not an edict to go headlong into delivering a project that was far beyond the capacity of the city to fund within its own resources. And it became clear early in the life of the proposal that there was no willingness on the part of any other party besides the Commonwealth who were prepared to contribute. Despite soaring escalation costs within the building industry and well-known significant operational costs for running an aquatic facility, the city doggedly carried on, giving residents the false impression that even a scaled-down RAF was still a possibility, when clearly it wasn't. Thank you.
Thank you for your deputation, Ms Brock. Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms Brock this evening? That's a no. Thank you, Ms Brock. I'd now like to invite Melissa Ledger of Subiaco, who is speaking against the officer recommendation at item 10.3.2. Welcome, Ms Ledger.
Hello, thank you for having me. Good evening, councillors and Mayor. My name's Melissa. I'm the Director of Cancer Prevention and Research at Cancer Council Western Australia, and I have oversight of our programs regarding alcohol and supporting healthy eating as part of my role there, and both of them are relevant to my deputation this evening. So I wish to address Council in relation to Agenda 10.3.2, the supply, installation and maintenance of bus shelters with advertising space. Cancer Council works with Western Australian local governments to use the levers that are within their control to protect children from exposure to advertising for alcohol and for unhealthy food and drinks. So we're talking about junk food and sugary drinks. Today, children and families are bombarded by alcohol and unhealthy food and drink advertising in every part of their lives, including on their way to school. The impact of advertising I'd like to talk about. The evidence shows that alcohol advertising is a cause of young people's drinking. It influences young people's beliefs and attitudes about alcohol use, their drinking behaviours, and increases the likelihood that teenagers will start drinking and using alcohol at an earlier age and drink at riskier levels. Alcohol is responsible for broad-ranging harms, all of which are high in WA, including injury, violence, chronic disease and mental health issues. Drinking alcohol is also a risk factor for 7 different types of cancer. The marketing of unhealthy food and drink influences the decisions young people make about the food and brands that they prefer, the food they buy and the food they eat, and for children, the food they pester their parents for. Unhealthy diets and living with overweight and obesity are the greatest risk factors for death and disease in Australia, second only to tobacco use. Over 2/3 of adults are above a healthy weight, and 1 in 4 Western Australian children are overweight or obese and face an increased risk of lifetime risk of disease and early death. Living with obesity and overweight is a risk factor for 13 different types of cancer. So I'm here tonight representing Cancer Council Western Australia, as our vision is for a cancer-free future for all Western Australians. And over the last 60 years, we have worked tirelessly and strived to achieve this vision through cancer research, advocacy, prevention programs, and support for people living with cancer. We seek to influence policy at all levels of government to create a healthy environment that will reduce the incidence and impact of cancer on our community. So how much unhealthy advertising is there on local government property? Ads on transport routes are a popular form of outdoor promotion, including for alcohol and unhealthy food and drinks. Ads on transport routes can't be switched off, they can't be avoided, and are often displayed on publicly owned property. 30% of the unhealthy food and drink advertising children see is in a public place. Audits on local government areas of all bus shelters show that up to 41% of all ads for unhealthy food and drinks are for unhealthy food and drinks and alcohol. Research conducted by the Telethon Kids Institute found 87% of foods on bus shelters within 500 metres of schools were for unhealthy food and alcohol. So what's the role of the City of South Perth in all of this? The City of South Perth have got a really powerful tool at their fingertips, and that's your Public Health Plan 2020 to 2025. It demonstrates the city's position to have a positive influence in protecting and promoting the health and wellbeing of the community. The plan includes a number of statistics, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but I think it's worth repeating again this evening. That 26% of residents drink at high risk levels for long-term harm. That's more than 2 standard drinks on any one day. While over 10% drink at high risk levels for short-term harm. 1/3 of residents ate fast food at least weekly. 91% of residents did not eat the recommended 5 serves of fruit and vegetables a day. 49% of residents ate less than the 2 serves of fruit a day. And 78% of residents are concerned about alcohol, the harmful use of alcohol. There's 3 priorities in the public health plan. I just want to focus on the chronic disease prevention and management pillar, because there's 2 key actions under that priority that talk about the issue at hand, and that's investigating the control of advertising of unhealthy food at city events and premises, and investigating scope and feasibility of an outdoor advertising policy restricting alcohol advertising on company-owned property. The public health plan provides a huge opportunity to consider the community needs to be healthy, to live productive and healthy lives, to deliver on the vision and goals set by the public health plan. However, I note in the briefing agenda, it includes a list of restrictions which the City of South Perth have placed on the tender, and notice the use of the advertising industry's voluntary self-regulation code when it comes to the promotion of alcohol, and no restriction for the promotion of unhealthy food and drinks on City of South Perth bus shelters. This is a missed opportunity to deliver on the statement within the City of South Perth's public health plan, and I do quote, "The City of South Perth is committed to improving the health and wellbeing of its community. The City's first public health plan is a guide to integrating public health focus into existing services and facilities and future public health initiatives. And the plan identifies areas where the City can make a contribution to the improvement of health outcomes for the community and visitors." The City of South Perth have used the Outdoor Media Association standards as the standards with which the tender will be implemented. It's important to recognise that these are industry standards and are not subject to government or public scrutiny. They're not independent. The Outdoor Media Association's National Health and Wellbeing Policy pledges to restrict the advertising of less healthy food and drink and alcohol products from being displayed within a 150-metre sightline of a primary or secondary school. This is an arbitrary figure. We know that self-regulatory measures, including the OMA or the Outdoor Media Association's policy, are weak and ineffective. They have no monitoring processes, no consequences for non-compliance, and are consistently found to be ineffective at reducing children's exposure to unhealthy advertising. We know the codes are often breached, but there are no penalties for these breaches. In fact, Cancer Council applies for funding so that we can undertake audits to try and keep the industry honest. Industry-led voluntary pledges will not reduce exposure to alcohol and unhealthy food and drink marketing in the City of South Perth. As I mentioned, advertising works. From 2017 to the end of 2022, the top 10 junk food advertisers, including McDonald's, Hungry Jack's, KFC, Domino's and Uber Eats, making up the top 5, spent over $105 million on advertising, not including any digital channels. So it's important we start to even the playing field. Our most recent survey, that's a representative sample of the Western Australian community, shows that there's support for such policies to include restrictions on junk food, sugary drink and alcohol advertising. 77% of the sample support removing alcohol advertising from public transport, including bus shelters, and 71% support removing junk food and sugary drink ads too. The ever-present promotion of unhealthy products normalises junk foods and sugary drinks and alcohol as everyday items. Household budgets are negatively impacted when buying junk food, sugary drinks and alcohol frequently. It's important to get this tender right now. Otherwise, it could be another 20 years before you get to change it. In 20 years' time, will we look back in horror when we realised we allowed the alcohol, junk food and sugary drink industries to target our children and young people? Do you recall a time when tobacco companies were allowed to advertise on almost every surface that they were allowed to? right up until the late 1980s and early 1990s. And we look back now in disbelief, and our young people can't believe that it ever happened. Once advertising restrictions started to come into place,
60 seconds left, Ms Ledger.
the rates of smoking started to drop. The tobacco industry opposed it every step of the way. In closing, the local governments are in a position to have a huge impact on reducing children and families' exposure to junk food and alcohol advertising. It's such an exciting opportunity for the City of South Perth. We ask all levels of government to take responsibility and try and reduce exposure to junk food, alcohol and sugary drink advertising. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Ledger. Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms Ledger while she's still at the desk there? Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you so much for your deputation, Mrs Ledger. First of all, I need to, for the benefit of council, that I actually invited Mrs Ledger to give a deputation for tonight, so thank you indeed. A question is, are you aware of any other local government or indeed a government agency within Western Australia that has taken the initiative to ban alcohol or discretionary foodstuff advertising on their public assets?
I am aware that the City of Mandurah have taken steps to reduce and restrict junk food, alcohol and sugary drink advertising. But I guess I'm not aware of the details. So I know that they have. I know that at the time we thought it could have gone a bit further, but it was certainly a step in the right direction.
Okay.
But it's certainly worth getting in touch with the City of Mandurah.
So, in your opinion, it's certainly a doable thing to do then?
I think that the City of South Perth, if this is something that's important in terms of protecting children and young people from advertising and promotion and the tactics of the junk food industry that are set to profit from us eating more and more of their product, then this is a step in the right direction. Our understanding is that the advertising space is not left blank, that it is filled by other people who want to use the advertising, and that's the experience we've seen internationally. I guess we've had some criticism that we can't compare Perth to London, and I think that's probably fair, but London Underground have gone and taken really significant steps in reducing exposure to junk food advertising and sugary drinks and other discretionary foods, and have started to see some success in reduction in people's behaviour and changes in diet. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for your deputation.
Thank you.
Any further questions, councillors? No. Thank you, Ms Ledger.
Thank you.
I'd now like to invite Mr Anthony Riccici of Chewett Hill, who is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.3.3. Welcome, Mr Riccici.
Mayor, councillors, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to 10.3.3. This is a very simple and small project. It's about how to invigorate a pretty difficult and oddly shaped piece of land at 60 Elizabeth Street in South Perth. And we started off with asking a question as to why this space is not developed. And when you look at the sort of issues that surround the particular lot, you realise that apart from its odd shape, it's difficult to develop on that triangle configuration. And there are two really beautiful old Art Deco apartment buildings that ought to be reinstated and remain. And more importantly, there's a high voltage power cable that runs through the entire front of the site that basically forces any form of development right to the very back and renders the entire redevelopment capacity of the site, at least in the early initial stages, really difficult. And until that goes, then development on the site is going to be very limited. So we ask ourselves a question, what can we do with the current site, that current vacant land, and so that there's a benefit to our client in terms of revenue, and how can it become more beneficial to the public at large? So we thought about this idea of having something that's transient, that's something that can be easily dismantled if it doesn't work, and something that has a high intrinsic recycled sort of environmental idea to it. So we came up with the idea of perhaps we could use the shipping containers and do them in a very artistic and sort of playful manner, sort of driving on from the pop-up culture that is pretty prevalent around some of the other local authorities. And that culture seems to promote community activity and social spaces and allow a life of its own to foster, if you like. And so the opportunities that come from that are really about embracing community life, and perhaps there could be cyclists that port themselves in that place, perhaps walking groups could port themselves in that place. And really it's a seating space that is a landscape solution with this recycled reinterpretive kind of installation placed into it. And look, if it doesn't work, it's pretty simple. We just pack it all up, take it away, and reinstate it back to a landscape solution. So the city has really nothing to lose from this. It does have, I understand there are some objections to it with regard to traffic and noise, but our traffic report lodged with our application says that the traffic impost is at low impact, and we do have a compliant car parking application on site. So there are enough bays for the commercial activity that is required. We've also got bike bays that are part of the installation. We've got art walls that we're thinking. We're hoping to get some really high quality baristas on board. In fact, one is pretty well known who wants to establish himself as a sort of guru barista in this very social sort of community space, which is really exciting. And there's a really beautiful frangipani tree that we're going to transplant and replant it in another portion of the site. And whilst our landscaping plan doesn't show it, but there also is an opportunity for us to introduce like a herb garden where we could grow stuff on site, and perhaps it becomes part of the produce that gets cooked on site. I mean, it's going to be low volume type cooking, burgers, fries perhaps, but principally a place for sit down, coffee, and community focused. So we saw this site as an opportunity that should be exploited rather than a danger that should be avoided. And so we're hoping that Council tonight views it in the same way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your deputation. Councillors, do we have any questions for Mr Rachichi this evening? That's a no. Thank you very much for your deputation. All right, that brings us to item 10, which is the draft May reports. I now hand you over to the Chief Executive Officer, Mr Mike Bradford, to take you through the balance of the draft May reports.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.1.1 is the Recreation Aquatic Facility. This report provides an update on the actions arising from the Special Council meeting held on the 30th of March 2023 regarding the proposed recreation and aquatic facility.
Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item this evening? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Just a couple of questions. The first one is, I note there's no mention of the Strategic Community Plan in the officer's report, and I'm just wondering whether the City Administration would also recommend that Strategy 1.2.3 of that strategic community plan be removed from the plan if the item was so endorsed by council next week?
Who should I direct that question to? Mr Adams?
So we're due to do a 2-year review of a minor review of the strategic community plan anyway, so it'll be part of that review later on in the year.
Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Choi?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you, Director Adams. So I note in paragraph 4 of the officer's recommendation in relation to the federal funding and engagement seeking to retain the $20 million grant for other projects. And I'm just wondering, this seems to be like a new development since the last officer recommendation on this item. And I'm just, is there any news or any sort of updates we might be able to receive on this front, please? As to maybe, what the city are hoping for, or what may have happened since the last meeting, that the city now thinks that you may be able to, ask for the 20 million. Thank you.
Mr Bradford?
We discussed when we proposed the recommendation at the previous special council meeting, we felt we were on more solid ground around seeking to retain the funds that we had. Really, we've reconsidered that and thought, well, why limit ourselves? If we're going to have discussions with the federal government, we should at least the starting point should be, is there an opportunity for retaining the whole? And that's why the change. Because of course, if council passes this resolution, we would have been limited. And so this provides a broader opportunity. So to be clear, this is something we would have to work on in terms of need to manage expectations very carefully.
Any further questions, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.1.2, City of South Perth Community Safety and Crime Prevention Plan 2022 to 2027. The City's Strategic Community Plan 2021 to 2031 includes a range of strategies related to creating a safe community. The City had a former Community Safety and Crime Prevention Plan that expired on the 30th of June 2022. A new draft Community Safety Crime Prevention Plan 2022 to 2027 has been developed by the City to outline how community safety outcomes will be incorporated within the City's community programs, services, projects, events and facilities into the future. The draft Community Safety and Crime Prevention Plan was advertised for community and stakeholder comment during March 2023. The final Community Safety and Crime Prevention Plan is now presented to Council for its endorsement.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Warland.
Thank you, Mayor, and apologies to the staff for this one, for not getting these in a bit earlier. Just to clarify on the stakeholder engagement here, was there any efforts made to talk to Main Roads about their input and potential use of their assets along Canning Highway or Kwinana Freeway to kind of help monitor some of these issues?
Should I send that to Mr Quigley or Ms Shaw? Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. My understanding is that no formal consultation was provided to Main Roads. The infrastructure that's provided adjacent to the freeway is more for traffic updates. As part of the Community Safety and Crime Prevention Working Group that the City has established, there's representatives from Roadwise for Walga, and so that would be the best avenue in terms of advocating for the use of any state government infrastructure to promote crime safety and prevention measures.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Any further questions? Councillor Warland?
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks, Ms Shaw. Just in terms of identification and designation of hotspot areas where we think there might be a problem, beyond police data for where those issues are and what they are, is there any other way the City might consider how we might identify and rectify those challenges?
Is that Ms Shaw? Yes.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. As part of the working group that's been established, there are representatives from the community that actually sit on that group. So that provides a valuable source of input in terms of any localised crime that's occurring. But otherwise, as you've identified, it's just based on the WA police crime statistics that are provided per suburb.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Navard.
Would the City please elaborate on the kinds of funding sources or possible external stakeholders or types of agencies that might assist the City in enhancing city safety and crime prevention?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. There are various examples of funding and grants available from the state government. So some examples of that include state government safety and security rebate, in-kind contributions from Neighbourhood Watch, and the Community Crime Prevention Fund. So the city will review all of those funding and grant opportunities, and will certainly be seeking to seek new opportunities for external funding sources in future if and when they become available.
Councillor Navard. Oh, any further questions, councillors? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I've got a few questions here which were provided on notice to Director Shaw. So my first question is in relation to the survey. So I note on pages 17 to 18 of the council agenda briefing attachments that residents' safety concerns between the city's former 2019-21 community safety plan and the current community safety plan 2022 to 27 have increased exponentially, in that the concerns has more than doubled, with the elderly and women feeling the most at risk of harm in relation to crime, and that residents' primary concerns being burglaries and theft is consistent with the WA Police crime statistics, which shows that the total crime for the majority of suburbs in the city has increased over the past 5 to 6 years, with stealing and burglaries named amongst the top 3 offences. As this concern is not just a perception of crime, in my opinion, but actual crime occurring, as supported by the statistics, and acknowledging that the state government has overall responsibility for policing, what is the city doing in relation to advocacy and lobbying of the state government to increase and improve resourcing in this area for the City of South Perth community, including, but not limited to, liaisons with the local member for South Perth, Mr Jeff Baker, MLA? I ask this question as I note that the implementation plan outlined from page 23 of the attachments in response to the city's identified priority areas outlined on page 22 of the attachments does not include any form of advocacy with the key funding stakeholder for policing and other relevant resources, being the state government, and I believe it may ought to.
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, and thank you to you, Councillor Choi, for providing the questions in advance. That was appreciated. So in response, the community feedback in the previous Community Safety and Crime Prevention Plan was based on 129 respondents, whereas the current survey was based on 409 respondents. And so that equates for, in terms of the percentage in differences in terms of feeling unsafe that were received through the survey. The city's strategic community plan includes advocacy outcomes within that document, and as we've heard earlier tonight, there is the opportunity for council to consider the actions contained within that plan when that review occurs shortly. The city also undertakes advocacy as part of its day-to-day business operations, including liaising with members of parliament, letters to the state government and the like. In terms of advocacy itself, whilst the specific action related to advocacy has not been included in the plan itself, a range of matters that provide for advocacy is included in the plan as it relates to relevant agencies. So, for example, you will see in the plan that there are actions related to liaising with the WA Police and appropriate stakeholders. And the city will continue to liaise with the WA Police on crime prevention and safety matters, as well as providing organisations, businesses, and different community groups opportunities to report issues related to safety and crime that are occurring within the city, and to provide assistance where we can to the police in terms of providing footage and the like for CCTV to help prevent and solve crimes occurring in the city.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi, another question?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you, Director Shaw. I understand that the city's Community Safety and Crime Prevention Group includes representatives from state government agencies, as Dr Shaw has just outlined, such as the Department of Communities, etc. But does it also include any state representative who can actually assist in lobbying for increased resourcing, including but not limited to invitations being extended to the local member for South Perth?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you. So the city facilitates the Community Safety and Crime Prevention Group, which is the group that I was just referring to, with representation from key government agencies and the local community. Members of the group include the Kensington Police, PCYC, Curtin University, Waterford Plaza, the Department of Communities, and as well as the local community representatives I mentioned earlier. And that group ensures community safety has a well-rounded approach to carry out a number of community safety initiatives and projects. The terms of reference for that group makes provisions for the local member to attend the group, who is invited to attend in all instances. The community group itself meets on a quarterly basis Elected members are currently able to attend in accordance with the terms of reference as a representative. They don't sit on the group, but they are invited to attend. However, following the elections, the local government elections in October 2023 this year, the city will be reviewing the terms of reference for all of its advisory groups, and that would be the opportunity for elected members to consider the terms of reference and whether there should be a formal representative from council on that group.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi, did you have another question?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor, and again to Director Shaw. As burglaries and home safety were the number one identified concern amongst residents in the city's latest community safety survey, and hence is the number one priority for the city as set out in the plan, what has the take-up of the city's home safety and security equipment rebate program been like to date? And does the city believe that enough residents know about the program to be able to access it, please?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you. So the city's home safety and security equipment rebate program has been in operation since September last year, so 9 months. And in that time, a total of 69 people have received a rebate, which equates to an allocation of $16,981 towards a range of community safety initiatives, including CCTV cameras, video doorbells, window and front door security screens, and sensor lights. So in terms of whether the program's been successful, I think given the uptake in the last 9 months, I would say it has been. The matter was discussed at the Community Safety and Crime Prevention Group as well, where the community representatives considered that it had been successful to date. And in addition to promotion on the city's media channels, just through word of mouth from other residents that have been recipients of the grant funding.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi, another question?
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and again to Director Shaw. As part of the current media budget review, Council endorsed the city's purchase of a new CCTV trailer with number plate recognition capability to assist police. And I'm just wondering, will the city be preparing a schedule or timetable of where this trailer will be situated out in the community at all times to make the most use and get the most benefit of this new community asset? Also, how will the city measure this asset's effectiveness against its objectives for which it was purchased?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the city is currently undertaking the procurement process for the CCTV trailer, and is planned for the trailer to be operational around the community in just early into the new financial year, so from June, July onwards. The city will schedule the trailer according to feedback from the WA Police in terms of any crime hotspots that have been identified, as well as appropriate feedback from the previous community group and community requests. So community members will be able to directly request the trailer be located in and around the suburbs effectively. In terms of monitoring whether or not it's effective or not, I think just the fact that the trailer is there and sending community messages out about raising awareness to lock vehicles and the like serves its purpose. It is difficult to monitor the effectiveness of that, but we can certainly liaise with Kensington Police in terms of whether they've considered that it is effective. So,
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Walland.
Along a similar vein to my earlier ones, was there any discussion had with the PTA about whether it be, bus assets or the train station at Canning Bridge, and whether that might be able to be accommodated in some of this, efforts around CCTV in particular?
Ms Shaw.
thank you, Mr Mayor. So my understanding is that CCTV that's associated with state government infrastructure is already linked into the WA Police network for CCTV. Local residents can also seek to liaise with WA Police to hook their private cameras into that network. So in terms of whether the PTA was engaged specifically, no. However, direct requests for footage and the like from their facilities would go to the WA Police.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, do we have any further questions for the administration on this item this evening? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.1, Tender 2 of 2023, Provision of Pump and Bore Maintenance Services. This report considers submissions received from the advertising of Tender 2 of 23 for the provision of bore and pump maintenance services. The report will outline the assessment process used for the evaluation of tenders received and recommends approval of the tender that provides the best value for money and level of service to the city.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item, bearing in mind there is a confidential attachment? Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. If the city can say, Do you know what the budget estimate was for this item, for the forthcoming budget?
Ms Anne Primo, can I send that one your way?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll have to take that one on notice, but I believe the budget is consistent with the current budget allocation.
Any further questions, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.2, Tender 3 of 2023, Supply, Installation and Maintenance of Bus Shelters with Advertising Space. This report considers submissions received from the advertising of Tender 3 of 23, Supply, Installation and Maintenance of Bus Shelters with Advertising Space. The report outlines the assessment process used for the evaluation of tenders and recommends approval of the tender that provides the most advantageous outcome to the city.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item, bearing in mind that there is a confidential attachment? Councillor Russell?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Will the state and federal legislation noted within the restrictions prohibit the advertising of gambling in any form?
Ms Anne Primo?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. The state and federal legislation places restrictions on the advertising of gambling and prohibits it in defined circumstances. The Australian Communications and Media Authority provides more information on national standards, including how a complaint can be made about advertising. And in WA, the Gaming and Wagering Commission is responsible for administering the law relating to gaming and wagering.
Thank you, Ms Anne Primo. Councillor Russell?
Yes, thank you. When the city states under D, not display any signs or advertisement which the city considers it is reasonable opinion to be immoral or offensive, is this a decision of council or of a city administration? And if it's a city administration decision, what's the mechanism that allows this?
Ms Anne Primo?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The administration of a contract is the responsibility of the city's administration. As it's a provision of the contract, the city would rely on industry standards and codes of practice current at the time of advertising to determine if an advert was considered immoral or offensive.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms Anne Primo. Another question, Councillor Russell?
Yes, thank you. So can you just confirm that the scope is only for 25 bus shelters?
Ms Anne Primo?
So the scope of the contract, proposed contract, is for 25 bus shelters. However, by agreement, it would be possible for additional bus shelters to be added.
And when you say by agreement, again, would that be a decision of the city administration or a decision by council to proceed with such?
It would be through the administration of the contract, so the city administration, not council decision. Once that contract is awarded, should it be awarded, it is the administration's domain to administer that contract, and any variation to it would have to be administered within the parameters of that contract.
Okay, thank you. Can you, and this one's not on notice, can you just give us an idea of actually what these refurbished or new bus shelters look like? For example, how many advertising panels are there? The size of the panels, the format of the panels, are they LED? Are they static? Are they the same footprint as the current bus shelters?
Okay, so there's a number of questions in there. Of the existing bus shelters that we have within the city that have adverts on, 20 of them under this agreement would be refurbished, so they would be as the current bus shelters are that have advertising on, and 5 of them are proposed to be replaced with electronic signage on. When it comes to what those bus shelters are, any new ones, they have to meet the PTA requirements in terms of disability access, and they also have to meet the requirements of the physical constraints within the road reserve at that point. So if there's obviously going to be a footpath adjacent to it, there needs to be sufficient clearance for the footpath adjacent to it. So that, in most instances, restricts the size of the bus shelter that can be put in place.
And in terms of advertisement panels, are you aware if it's 1, 2, many more, the size of those?
That will depend on the configuration of the bus shelter itself. So they generally have them on the end, but it depends on the size and the dimensions and the configuration of the bus shelter, because they come in a whole variety of sizes depending on the location.
Okay. And this was actually a question on notice. So could the city advise council where the 25 bus shelters are that are proposed to be either replaced or refurbished?
Yeah, and that list was circulated to yourself.
Or was it?
Yep.
Today? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions on this item, councillors? Councillor D'Souza.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. When was the last time the city had, I guess, an operating bus shelter ad contract?
Ms Amprema.
I believe that the contract expired a number of years ago, but I haven't been able to trace exactly when the expiry was.
And again, I appreciate this would likely precede most of the senior staff on council, just from my context. And would that have led to, what would have been the operating environment in those intervening years in terms of would advertisers have had access to city bus stops, and in terms of where would the how would revenue be managed?
Ms Amprema.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. At the end of the previous arrangement, the incumbent advertiser continued to have access to advertise on those bus shelters, and they continued to maintain those bus shelters. So the city has not had to maintain those bus shelters, but it also hasn't received any revenue from advertising.
Thank you, Ms Ampremo. Councillor D'Souza, another question?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Ms Ampremo. So is there any way for the city to I guess, claw back or obtain that revenue which was lost for those previous years where there was no contract?
Ms Ampremo.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, there isn't.
Thank you, Ms Ampremo. I might ask a couple of questions myself. The officer report says that the request for tender was advertised in January of this year and that the request for tender closed in March. And of course, it's now May. In theory, what would be the consequences for the city if council were to cancel the current tender and require the commencement of a fresh tender?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You know, we obviously can't say for certain what the outcome of rerunning this process would be. There certainly would be a reputational risk to the city around recommencing a process. There's no guarantees that we will get as financially advantageous outcome from any future process. You know, it's obviously open to council to do that, but there are certainly some risks around not proceeding with this, and there's also the obvious cost to the administration and hence the community of rerunning a tender process, which isn't cheap in terms of staff time that goes into it.
Thank you. And my second question relates to an email that council has received from a gentleman earlier today expressing concern about the maintenance of our bus shelter infrastructure. Would the successful tenderer, whoever they may be, would they be incentivised to maintain the bus shelters to an appropriate standard and replace bus shelters where required?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So perhaps just for some context to this, there are 290 bus stops in the city of South Perth. What we're looking at is having advertising on 25 of those, but there's still 128, I believe, outside of that have bus shelters associated with them, which have to be maintained by the city. As you noted, there is concern from members of the community about the state of some of those bus shelters. Those bus shelters are ones that are currently the responsible of the city to maintain. However, the current budget provisions limit the work that can be done on them, so it's fairly minimal. It's restricted to removing excrement from the bus shelters and graffiti and essential repairs. And beyond that, we do a very limited amount. We have a programme to replace a minimal number of those. But certainly, if we have to take on another 25 bus shelters that are currently being maintained by someone else, that obviously stretches the budget even further, and we're unlikely to see an improvement in the condition unless there's further budget allocation from somewhere to do that.
Thank you for that answer. I guess what I'm asking is if a successful tender is intending to run advertisements, is there an incentive, a commercial incentive on any such tenderer to keep the bus shelters looking nice?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And apologies if I didn't adequately answer your original question. The bus shelters that are currently being maintained that have advertising on them, and the maintenance is by the advertising provider, they are maintained to a much higher standard than the ones that are maintained by the city.
Thank you very much. Councillors, Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My first question, again, provided on notice to Director Shaw prior to the meeting. On what grounds can a tender such as this one be legitimately refused in the administration's view by council?
Ms Amprema or Mr Adams? Mr Adams.
So council can determine not to accept the tender for any number of reasons. Those reasons just need to be articulated and captured in the minutes. I would note, however, it's not good practice and probably doesn't achieve a lot simply not to approve the officer's recommendation. There'd need to be an alternate motion not to accept any of the proposed tenders. Otherwise, you leave the decision in limbo.
Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Director Adams. And just following on from the Mayor's questions. So I understand my next question was around the implications, but I believe that's already been answered. So in terms of the tender, is there so I understand that cancelling of the tender is not desirable, and there's multiple reasons for that, as has been expressed. But I'm just wondering, is there any opportunity for there to be, like, the tender to be renegotiated if council so wished it to be? Like, would that be, could that comprise like an alternative motion that Director Adams was kind of alluding to, rather than it being outwardly rejected? Is there an opportunity for it to be renegotiated based on what we've heard in the deputation tonight in respect to the social impact on the community's health and wellbeing, in respect only to the advertising, no other part of the tender that I'm speaking to?
Mr Adams?
We can't change the scope of the tender once it's closed. So we went out with a scope which was advertised to the market, and people would have chosen to tender or not tender based on the scope that we put out. So a new tender process would need to be started with a revised scope, and if desired by council, additional restrictions within that scope on the type of advertising, which may result in little or no interest from the market. We don't know until we go down that path. But it's likely that there would be a different approach to a tender that had greater restrictions in it from the market.
I might ask another question at this point. I did notice in the officer report that there are a significant number of pre-existing restrictions on advertisements and signs. It's got a heading at page 20 of this report. Are you able to take us through the existing restrictions that exist in respect of signage that might be featured on bus shelters? And I don't know whether that's Ms Amprema or Mr Adams, but happy with either.
If you're referring to what's in the report, the contractor must not display any advertisement which, in the opinion of the city, is political, religious or pornographic in nature and likely to be considered offensive. Not display any advertisement depicting smoking or tobacco products. Not display any advertisement which resembles any traffic sign or has the appearance of giving any instruction or any direction to traffic which constitutes a traffic hazard. not display any signs or advertisements which the city considers in its reasonable opinion to be immoral or offensive, and to comply with the alcohol advertising pre-vetting system developed by the Outdoor Advertising Association of Australia or any other similar document or regime, and will display the relevant AAPS approval on all advertisements for alcohol.
Mr Bradford?
There's one kind of level of restriction that isn't immediately obvious perhaps, is when we actually discussed going out to tender for this probably more than 12 months ago, having discovered that the previous contract had lapsed, was a discussion around what those restrictions that had just been described as being those that are following PTA's own processes, but also, and you heard the number of bus shelters the city has, which is about 150 odd in total. A deliberate decision was taken to limit the number of bus shelters, and that was done, those that would be attractive advertising on main bus routes, but also proximity to schools and things like that. So the number of bus shelters is also a restriction in terms of the availability of advertising in itself.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, Councillor Choi?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Just one last question, and moving away from the advertising, just in terms of maintenance, does the city undertake an audit? Like once, tenders accepted, is there sort of like some sort of auditing process? Because some of the, as the Mayor alluded to, councillors did receive this email from a concerned residents, and the photos were pretty appalling of some of the state of those bus shelters. And I'm just wondering, is that just due to not having a contract in place, or is it they weren't part of the maintenance, or were they just poorly maintained? That was all.
Ms Anne Prima?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The bus shelters that you're referring to that were in poor state of repair are ones that are in fact maintained by the city, not by the contractor who is maintaining it. So the ones that are subject to advertising are generally kept to a very high standard, because it's in their interest to make sure that they look good and the advertising is effective. So the complaints are not coming in relation to bus shelters that have advertising on, they are coming in relation to bus shelters that the city is responsible for maintaining. And as I said earlier, the maintenance carried out by the city is very much restricted to the essentials.
Thank you, Ms Anne Prima. Councillors, any further questions on this item this evening? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.3, proposed cafe/restaurant addition to multiple dwellings, lot 174, number 60 Elizabeth Street, South Perth. To consider an application for development approval for a cafe/restaurant addition to multiple dwellings on lot 174 or number 60 Elizabeth Street, South Perth. The item is referred to council as the proposed use is a discretionary and with consultation land use within the residential zone, and therefore falls outside the delegation of officers. For the reasons outlined in the report, it is recommended that the application be approved, subject to conditions.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions on this item this evening? I think Councillor Choi was first there by a microsecond.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Look, I've got a number of questions, again, provided on notice to Director Shaw, but I'm happy to let Councillor Navard go first this time if she'd like.
Councillor Navard?
Thank you both. Would the city please advise on how the city might assist in ensuring the residents of the 5 rental units at 60 Elizabeth Street continue to enjoy a quality of living in the event a small food business begins trading in the site? The renters will be in a poor negotiating position if the quality of their living arrangements are severely undermined by the trading activities of 16 hours per day, and with a likely addition of early deliveries of fresh products prior to 7 a.m. Affordable rentals are scarce in South Perth, and we wouldn't want to jeopardise the future of one of the few facilities available. Thank you.
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the first comment I'd make would be in relation to the application requirements for lodging and development application. And given despite the fact that this proposal is on the same site as the multiple dwellings, the consent of the residents of those multiple dwellings is not required as they're not the landowners of the site. So the landowner has signed the application form in the first instance to enable the application to be accepted for assessment by the city. In terms of the impact on the residents, the city reviewed the proposal in light of not only the multiple dwellings that are already on the site, but also in light of surrounding residential development. To reduce the potential amenity impacts associated with the use, there are a number of measures that are contained either within the development proposal itself or that the city has recommended to be included as conditions of development approval. So some of those measures include screening to the decked portion of the upstairs section of the sea container to make sure there's no overlooking impacts, ensuring the bin stores located the furthest away from the existing dwellings, ensuring that the car parking required to service both the development and the multiple dwellings itself remains appropriate for the dwellings and the future use. Requiring a landscaping plan as a condition of development approval to enhance the existing landscaping that's provided on site, and ensuring that no new additional car parking bays would be located in the area of existing landscaping to the front next to the multiple dwellings. Requiring an acoustic report in support of the application and for any measures identified in that report to be implemented prior to occupation of the development. Conditions relating to lighting of pathways to ensure that there's no impact in terms of intrusive impacts of lighting, although I do note, given the location of the site, the lighting to Canning Highway may otherwise already impact some of those residents. A waste management plan in terms of the collection and collection of waste associated with those bin stores. That would also deal with any potential waste associated with deliveries, which we can control in terms of the noise regulations, in terms of the timing of deliveries and the like. And you'll see there's also some conditions there that have been recommended not only by us but by Main Roads Western Australia in terms of the advertising signage that's proposed. So that's making sure that the future signs don't flash or pulsate and the like, which would otherwise cause a disturbance to those residents. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Vard or Councillor Choi? By all means.
Would the city please advise particularly on how the noise impact created by the right angle arrangement of the container building to the existing building could be contained to an acceptable level, given that the cafe configuration would differ from many cafes that are positioned close to the road on a ground floor at the front of a mixed-use building? Yeah.
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the right angles of the sea containers themselves aren't necessarily the thing that would potentially cause non-compliance with the noise regulations itself. The way that they measure the acceptable limits in terms of that is based on the separation distance to the nearest noise-sensitive land use, which is based on multiple dwellings. So effectively from 15 metres away from the proposal. So for example, in the example that you gave with mixed-use developments where the cafe would otherwise be downstairs, that could arguably have more of an impact on noise for adjacent residences than something that's located on a site like this in that configuration. The city has recommended a condition for an acoustic report. Obviously, we can't see what any measures would be proposed by that acoustic consultant until we receive the report, which I can touch on a bit later. But in terms of some of the measures that they can look at implementing in an application like this, it can be things like acoustic louvers, double glazing to any openings and windows. Acoustic mineral wool can be put in the walls of the sea containers to provide noise attenuation. And if it needed it, which we can consider through the building permit process, things like reinforced timber framing on the inside of the sea containers themselves, just to provide that extra level of noise attenuation in the building itself.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi, you had a question there?
Yes, I've got a few here. Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the first one is, can the city please confirm that this proposed development is purely for an outdoor cafe restaurant, as I believe is depicted in the plan contained on page 43 of the attachments, i.e. there is no indoor dining plans included in the DA?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the proposal includes the outdoor alfresco dining and the seating area below, which is shown on the site plan, but it also includes the use of the upper level deck. So even though no seating has been provided on that upper level deck, for the purposes of assessment, we've assumed that that is included in an area that people would otherwise use. However, there's no formal internal dining per se. It's only the kitchen area itself and the ablution facilities that are otherwise contained within the sea container.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi?
Thank you through the Chair, Director Shaw. Can the City please confirm whether the proposed shipping container style cafe restaurant will be permitted to sell or will be permitted to allowed to be have BYO alcohol service on premises, please?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you. So the sale of alcohol is not proposed. The applicant has provided a cover letter which explains what they're trying to do as part of that, and that cover letter specifically stated that non-alcoholic beverages would be sold to customers. If the applicant in future sought to sell alcohol, they would first require licensing from Racing, Gaming and Liquor. Depending on the type of licence that they were seeking, it would then otherwise trigger the need for a revised development application based on the land use itself. So, for example, if they were seeking to provide alcohol without a meal, they may require a small bar licence, which would then trigger the need for development application to change the use from cafe restaurant to small bar. Department of Racing, Gaming and Liquor consults with the city when they're considering licence applications, and the city is required to give confirmation to the department that they have the appropriate planning approvals in place before they'll issue the licence. So there's a few levels of protection there.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Chair, again, Director Shaw. Can the City please confirm how many cafe restaurants it's aware of located in residential streets of the city that operate 7 days a week for 16 hours a day, as I can't think of any?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you. So the opening days and times of other businesses is actually not a matter that can be considered when considering this application based on this being a quasi-judicial application, which all development applications are. So in terms of how council needs to consider this application, any quasi-judicial decision needs to be made reasonably based on planning considerations only. So opening hours themselves are not strictly a planning consideration, but matters associated with extended opening hours such as noise, impacts on car doors opening and closing, etc., as people are attending the premises can be considered amenity impacts, and those have been considered in the report. And for the reasons outlined in the report and by virtue of draft conditions, the city considers that those matters can be dealt with. In terms of the opening hours themselves, cafes and restaurants aren't covered by the Retail Trading Hours Act, only shops are. So even if there was a separate piece of legislation that otherwise dealt with trading hours of restaurants, we wouldn't be able to capture it through the planning process. We would only otherwise be able to provide an advice note recommending that they comply with that separate piece of legislation. So as I mentioned, even though I can see the concern is relating to the impacts associated with those hours, conditioning the actual hours themselves and restricting them, it's not actually covered in terms of the planning framework.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi?
Thank you through the Chair again, Director Shaw. Given the residential area, the proposed operating hours, the noise concerns raised by residents during the community consultation period, and the intended use of the land, as noted by the applicant in their covering letter contained in page 52 of the attachments, to include activation and a community-driven space for social interaction, with the service area to be purely or mainly outdoors, is it possible for the City to ask the applicant to submit an acoustic report as noted as a condition at paragraph 6 of the officer recommendation on page 23 of the council agenda prior to council's deliberation on this item, please?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And this might be a bit of a lengthy response in terms of noise because this was the primary concern in relation to the application. So as you can see in the officer recommendation, there is a condition related to requesting an acoustic report and those measures to be implemented prior to occupation of the development and as part of the building permit application. In terms of seeking that report, conditions of development approval can be used only where they're not seeking to substantially alter or change what's been applied for as part of the application. So it's not uncommon to include conditions related to waste management, acoustic plans, landscaping and the like, where the implementation of those plans wouldn't otherwise materially alter the application for that they're seeking to seek approval for. So the wording of the draft condition itself has been worded that way to ensure that where there are any measures identified through the acoustic report that would otherwise need to be implemented, those details would need to be included in the subsequent application for a building permit prior to occupation. In terms of why an acoustic report wasn't otherwise provided upfront as part of this application, given the unique nature of the development being sea containers instead of masonry construction methods, it was considered more appropriate to receive the acoustic report as a condition of approval, because at the time that the applicant would otherwise proceed to detailed building permit drawings, they would be in a better position to understand how it's actually been developed, to determine what acoustic measures would otherwise need to be implemented as part of those working drawings for the building permit itself. So regardless of all of that associated framework with acoustic reports, the separate legislation being the Environmental Protection Noise Regulations would be applicable not only to the ongoing operation of the proposal itself, but not only in terms of the building and mitigation from that respect, but also the operation in terms of patrons attending the premises itself. So in terms of the noise regs and how they actually operate, the noise regs don't actually prescribe timeframes in which you have to operate. And this goes back to what I was speaking about earlier in terms of the hours of operations. So the regulations don't prescribe you must close at, say, 10 p.m. and the like. But what they do is when the city measures noise, they add what's known as influencing factors to the noise assessment, depending on the time frame and the nature of the activity that's occurring on the site. So what would happen in terms of the acoustic report is a measurement would be undertaken based on the nearest noise sensitive land used, based on the likely noise that would be experienced during those operating hours. And then the report that we've requested the details for is such that we can actually test and ground truth those assumptions that have been included in the acoustic report that we would receive as part of the building permit drawings itself. So hopefully that covers noise. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms Shaw, and very comprehensive. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Thank you through the chair, and Director Shaw, you blow me away with some of your comprehensive responses. I'll have to listen back later and digest all of that, but thank you very much for that considered response. So my next question was, why is the city recommending approval of this DA against policy P308 in respect to the proposed signage for the cafe restaurant? i.e., why can't the applicant just comply with the city's policy requirements in this respect?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And this goes back to the nature of local planning policies themselves. So local planning policies do not form part of the local planning scheme and they're not a statutory instrument. But what they're there for is to guide discretionary decision making and to set some parameters in which an applicant would otherwise assume that they would receive a favourable decision if they complied with the requirements in the policy. But as I said, they don't bind council in their decision making. So when you're considering the objectives and requirements of a local planning policy against what's proposed, council needs to have regards to first the initial intent of the local planning policy, and in this case the specific objective of this policy is to make sure that signage doesn't have an adverse impact specifically on adjacent residential property. So that's the starting point. And given that they didn't comply with the specific parameters contained within the policy, we then undertake an assessment against relevant planning matters related to that, which in this instance, advertising requirements are actually contained within local planning scheme. And in considering those requirements, the scheme requires the city to have regard to matters such as the character and context of the locality, whether the site's heritage listed, whether there are any traffic implications associated with the signs themselves. And in considering all of those things, and as detailed, I think on page 26 of the report, on balance, it was considered that given this development is in a mixed-use context adjacent to the highway, the signage could be controlled in terms of flashing, pulsating, not having digital signs and the like. It was considered that it generally complied with the intent of the local planning policy and was therefore capable of approval under the scheme.
Thank you again, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi, another question?
Yes, thank you. Through the chair again, Director Shaw. Can the city please confirm that the illuminated signage proposed is fixed lettering signage, not a display, advertising screen or screens?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, that's correct. And proposed condition number 19 seeks to restrict the use of electronic and digital format signs.
Thank you again, Ms Shaw. Any further questions, Councillor Choi?
Yes, thank you. Through the chair again, Director Shaw. I note the officer's report states at page 28 of the agenda that the applicant has proposed white illumination of signs, which would be unlikely to cause confusion with the coloured traffic signals. As unlikely is not a certainty, what are the implications for the council and the city if the signage does appear to cause confusion to motorists once approved and erected?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the city referred the application to Main Roads WA, who would otherwise provide advice in matters related to traffic safety, especially where it's adjacent to Canning Highway. And Main Roads came back with recommended conditions, which have been incorporated into the proposed officer recommendation. And that some of those are listed there, which go back to pulsating, flashing, chasing and the like, to make sure that there's otherwise no confusion. From the city's perspective, given it's proposed to be white and otherwise wouldn't be conflated with red, orange or green, we didn't believe that there would be an issue with any confusion with the traffic signals at Douglas.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi?
Thank you. Through the chair again, Director Shaw. Does the traffic engineer's assessment report contained on pages 54 to 55 of the attachments include Uber Eats style delivery drivers coming and going to and parking at the cafe restaurant to pick up food for customers? Also, how was the traffic engineer able to conclude that 100% of parking requirement will be provided on site for the cafe restaurant when only 4 patron car parking bays are being provided as outlined in his report? Is the city satisfied with this assessment?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So traffic generation rates are based in the traffic impact assessment that was provided in support of the application are based on Road and Traffic Authority Guide to Traffic Generating Developments, which I believe is the New South Wales document. And that provides the acceptable basis for trip generation associated with development proposals. So the guide itself doesn't actually provide for food delivery services, but you would typically assume that if there's something like a Uber Eats attending the premises, that would otherwise offset the patrons that would otherwise go to collect the food themselves and attend the premises. So the impact on trip generation itself for the application, you could argue, would be negligible. In terms of the parking, the city considered the access and egress to the site in addition to the existing car parking arrangements for the multiple dwellings as well as what's required for the development. So the total number of bays required for the site is actually 9 based on the scheme requirements. And that's made up of 4 for the proposed cafe restaurant and 5 for the multiple dwellings on the site. The applicants proposed 11 bays on site. So there is a surplus, technically there's a surplus of bays provided on the site. And I can assume that that's the assumption that the traffic consultant would have made in stating that 100% of the parking requirement has otherwise been met. That would be based on 100% of the scheme requirements have actually been met.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi, how many more questions do you have?
It's my last one. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
All right, please proceed.
Is the development site part of the Canning Highway Reserve? And if so, what are the implications, if any, of this, please?
Ms Shaw.
I think you know it's not actually within the Canning Highway Primary Regional Road Reserve, it's abutting.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, does anyone else have any other questions for the administration? Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I've seen many applications where there's been an acoustic report as part of the DA, and the acoustic report is for the benefit or the amenity for both the on-site residents and also the adjoining residents or within the locality. So I'm still a little bit confused why an acoustic report is not required as part of this DA, and it will be part of a post-DA approval.
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. It's certainly required as part of the DA because any condition of development approval that requires a subsequent report forms part of the development application itself. And the wording of the condition requires any proposed acoustic measures to be implemented as part of that. So, for example, if the acoustic report, when it's provided as part of those building permit drawings, any measures that are contained in that, if they're not actually implemented to the satisfaction of the city, it would be an enforcement matter under the Planning and Development Act to which the city could undertake compliance action. So the only reason that the acoustic report wasn't provided up front is given the unique nature of the development itself and the construction. It's not masonry. You wouldn't have standard assumptions based on that. So we would need to see that level of detail based on recommendations from an acoustic consultant as part of the detailed design drawings. But it certainly forms part of the approval should council approve the application.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Any further questions on this item, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.1, listing of payments for April 2023. This report presents the council a list of accounts paid under delegated authority between 1 and 30 April 2023.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item this evening? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.2, monthly financial statements for April 2023. The monthly financial statements are provided within the attachments A through I with a higher level of analysis contained in the comments of the report.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item? Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just with regard to the year-to-date outturn, obviously it's looking more favourable than was originally planned. Just I suppose an estimate as to where we're going to land at the end of the year. Are we still going to be in a similar position? And if not, do we have some large additional expenditures that need to be adjusted? For example, the employee entitlements benefit.
Should I send that to Mr Adams or Mr Lecoq? Mr Lecoq.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. At this point in time, there's no significant indicators that we would not achieve the revised budget figures that we are forecasting. However, it's reasonably early, as at the end of April, to make those assumptions. And yes, year-end adjustments will have to be made, which will include employee entitlements, etc. A lot of the variances that seem to be favourable at this point in time are mostly made up of timing variances, so they may well resolve themselves as we approach financial year end.
Thank you, Mr Lecoq. Councillor Brenda Brandis, another question?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. And just following on from that question, with regard to the employee entitlements benefit, obviously indexation will be quite significant on the annual leave balances, and just is there a rough indication as to what percentage or how much that might impact the closing balances or what we have right now as an outturn?
Mr Lecoq?
Through the Mayor, at this point in time, we haven't compiled those latest index figures and put them into a model. However, that is part of the planning, is to have that done before financial year end, and to have the variables that impact on those provisions and the assumptions that impact on them revised, taking into account the current financial environment.
Thank you, Mr Lecoq. Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And just one final question on the same topic. For the revised employee entitlements benefit, will that be appearing in the June financial reports, or will that be in the audited financial statements?
Mr Lecoq?
The initial base estimates will be appearing in the June reports.
Thank you, Mr Lecoq. Councillors, any further questions on this item this evening? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.3, correspondence between the Department of Local Government, Sport and Cultural Industries and the City of South Perth. This report is to seek Council's endorsement to release the City's response to the Department of Local Government, Sport and Cultural Industries letter dated 21 December 22 in relation to governance concerns.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item this evening? That's no. Okay. In that case, that wraps up item 10. We now move on to item 12, which is motions of which previous notice has been given. That's nil this evening. Item 15 is meeting closed to the public. This is ordinarily where we'd go behind closed doors if there was any questions relating to confidential matters, but there are no such questions this evening, which brings us to item 16, which is closure. So before I close the meeting, I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance and participation this evening. I declare the meeting closed at 7:34 p.m. Thank you all and good night.